So welcome everyone to OWASP Foundation 2021 Virtual AppSec. And today I'll be talking about Magecart, the rising threat to e-commerce websites. So this topic is related to a kind of attack which is not very commonly known to people. So I will be trying to talk about this attack in a very simpler terms, in a very simpler way, so it gets easier to understand what actually happens in the real world scenarios. So moving ahead. So before that, I would start with a small introduction of mine. I work at Qualys under WAF Research, and I'm one of the committee member for OWASP via Women in Application Security. I'm also the tech lead and vice chair for Breaking Barriers Women in Cybersecurity and mentor and website designer for the Cyber Preserve community. Recently, I've become an expert for web technologies at Google Developers Expert, and I have been a speaker or trainer at various conferences. Also, I am a technical and active blogger at Shrutirupa.me. And yes, I am a learner and explorer. Whenever there is any new kind of topic which is coming into picture, I am always there to learn and know more about it. Sometimes I write about all these things as well in my blogs. So let's get started. Today's agenda is very simple. For this session, we are just going to understand what is the Magecart, why is it happening, and how is it happening. Once you understand or you answer these three questions, you have to figure out the solutions. We cannot find a solution to any kind of problem just by, just knowing that, okay, this is a problem, there's an existence of the problem, but you have to know what is there in the problem, what is actually happening in that thing. For example, if you're into security and if you're doing vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, in that case, the first thing that you try to do is analyze the application, whichever application it is, be it a web application, mobile application, anything. The first and the foremost thing is information gathering, where you try to figure out what is the application all about, how is it functioning, what is it trying to do. Once you understand all these aspects, including the kind of technology, programming language, services such as cloud services, vendor they are dependent on, once you figure out all these things, then it becomes very easier to analyze the problem. And once you analyze the problem, once you understand what the problem is actually over there, you start figuring out how to solve the problem. And at that point of time, you understand what solutions could be implemented. In the same way, after answering these three questions, what, why, and how, we'll get to the solutions and understand what could be done to prevent these kinds of attacks. Of course, nothing is 100% secure, but we can at least try to reduce the risk. So what is a Magecart? Magecart is actually a group of hackers. And of course, if they're hackers, they're performing cyber attacks. Their main target is always an e-commerce websites. Why is it an e-commerce website? Because a lot of payment processing happens over there. So their intention is always to steal some payment related information, which we very oftenly call as personal identifiable information, PII, which includes our credit card information, our debit card information. So these group of hackers are aiming at big organizations who are based on e-commerce websites or working on e-commerce websites, and they try to steal information. How are they trying to steal those informations? They're using digital skimming. We'll understand what digital skimming means in a while. There's an interesting fact that the term Magecart has roughly come from the very famous e-commerce website Magento. You must have heard about Magento. It is another one very famous CMS. So from there, the term has arrived. Before understanding what digital scheming means, it is very important to understand what the term scheming means. Once you understand what scheming means, you know if it is done digitally, it is digital scheming, right? So what is scheming? It is just a simple, fraudulent practice that the hackers perform where they are trying to steal your credit card details, your debit card details, your PIN number, ATM number. How are they doing that? They are actually putting some kind of skimmers. These are certain devices that are used, and they put these devices over there, on the ATM machines or the devices which are used for doing some kind of transaction. Normal users are unaware of the fact that this system, there's a device which is attached to this system. So the normal people are unaware of this fact, and they end up, obviously, while during the transaction, end up putting their pins or any other card details, and those card details get stolen by the hackers. So this is called skimming, that actually happens in real world scenario. Now, when this kind of hacking, this kind of fraudulent practice happens digitally, it is called digital skimming. So here, obviously, the hackers are not using any kind of skimmers as such, but they are using some other kinds of ways to perform the digital skimming. So we'll be understanding all those things in a while. So I hope you are now aware of the fact who Magecart attackers are, what is scheming, and what is digital skimming. Note, PII stands for personally identifiable information, as I mentioned before. So these kinds of information are always targeted by the attackers so that they can steal these. Now the questions arise, why? Why do these attackers have to steal these informations? Why do they have to do it? Of course, we all know the answer, because they want to either sell these details on the dark web, or maybe they will directly do some money laundering using that. They might try to steal all the money. They would take it in their account. They might steal. They can perform any kind of things. They might try to perform some kind of illegal activity using their PII details. They sometimes, what happens, they also target some companies. Some big, huge organizations are often targeted when such kinds of attacks happen. You must have heard about how ransomware attacks certain kind of organizations. Or for example, we are very aware of the SolarWind attack, how it happened, what happened to it. So these are some of the reasons why the attackers try to steal information. Of course, these are benefiting them. They are getting a large amount of money. So of course, there could be some other reasons as well, but these are some of the very common reasons for why the attackers are actually targeting or trying to perform these kinds of attack. So moving ahead, the very important question is, how is it happening? How is the Magecart attack happening in real world scenario? So it is quite obvious that the applications, the e-commerce websites, are very huge. They are not made up of just one web page or two web pages. They comprise of a number of web pages over there. All these together form the huge website that they are presenting to the world, to the internet. And each of the web page is actually equally important. Now, initially, I discussed a bit about how information gathering happens. Now, when you are trying to do information gathering for any kind of information, for any kind of application, you look for the kind of technology that application is using, the kind of languages that they're using, the kind of services they are dependent on, cloud services, other kinds of services, anything that could be anything. Are they dependent on any third-party softwares or some third-party websites? So this is the trick. This is where the actual problem happens. There is nothing wrong in loading certain JavaScripts or taking services from the third party, but it is very important to understand whether the third party is itself secure enough. Maybe your application is very secure and it's very difficult to, break the security system over there. But if it is dependent on a third party software or an application, and if that third-party software is not secure or it is having some kind of flaw, it may compromise the entire application, your entire website. So this is what happens with the Magecart. So the attackers look for the kind of services that these websites are dependent on, basically the third-party tools that they might be using, third-party services, third-party scripts that they might be using. How do they get to know about this? Again, a lot of information gathering. They have a good enumeration skills. They try to figure out each and everything that their application is dependent on. So from there, they try to understand. Now, why do certain applications make use of, these third-party softwares? Just for advertisement is one very common reason, but there are other reasons also. Like sometimes if you are trying to build an application which is supposed to give the location of any particular kind of building, maybe, so they might use Google Map. Of course, we know Google is all secure. So these are some reasons why people tend to use the organizations, to be more specific, tend to use third-party softwares in their applications. Now, if these third-party gets compromised, the entire product can get compromised. Now, however big you are, huge this organization is, if there is one little flaw even present over there, the attacker would figure out each and every way to break it down and perform a very huge kind of attack on the organization, because there is one very simple thing which I have learned, especially during vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, is nothing is 100% secure. So even if there is a very simple flaw that you have found in an application, it is very important to tell that organization that this problem is present over there. Because it may look like a flaw at this point of time, but there would be some other person who can actually turn that flaw into a vulnerability. And once it turns into a vulnerability, it can easily be turned into an exploit. So it is possible. One person may not get that particular hack, but the other person might actually give, because every other individual has their own approach. So it is very important that if you see any kind of simplest of the simplest flaw in your application, just try to make sure that you are taking care of it, you're securing it. So yes, moving ahead. Is it that difficult to detect? So while doing my research on the Magecart attacks, one thing that I realized that yes, it is a bit difficult to detect. Why is it a bit difficult to detect? We'll try to analyze in the next slide. So yes, there are a number of points over here, and I'll explain each and every point in detail. So the very first thing is the attackers are using highly obfuscated malicious JavaScript code. Now, what is obfuscation? Whenever an application, or if there is a researcher, or suppose a malicious attacker is writing a malicious script, then they would not want other people, especially the researchers, to go through the code snippet, to break the code and read what is it all about. So they would try to obfuscate it. How do they obfuscate it? They do some changes to the code such that it becomes unreadable to the normal user. So you don't understand what is there in the code even after trying some basic tools to analyze what is present in the code. So they try all these things. So as a result, it becomes very difficult to understand what is the code all about. So the first step, if you ever see such kind of application, the first step is always there to de-obfuscate the code. And now this obfuscation makes it very difficult. Now, which particular part they obfuscate? They make sure that they're obfuscating the logic part. A number of times what they're actually doing is, when we are making a transaction, the digital transaction, when we are putting or while we are putting our PII details, such as the credit card information, debit card information, each and everything, we click on the pay option. we see that our information is going to the actual server that they were using, the payment server, but there is another malicious path that have been put within it that we cannot see, that we cannot actually understand, and our details reach to those malicious URLs as well, to those malicious servers. So that is the reason they're obfuscating. They're obfuscating the code. They're hiding the actual logic behind the code so that it becomes unreadable by the normal users. Also, they are trying to hide the path that they're using while sending our details to that malicious URL. So this is one foremost reason why it becomes a bit difficult to analyze this. The next thing what happens is when the victim user is clicking on the payment option, as I mentioned, they give their details. So it goes to another crafted URL because it is present in the obfuscated JavaScript code. So I explained it quite a bit. Now, apart from all these things, if the application or the third party application it is dependent on is vulnerable to some other kinds of attacks. Of course, the people who are the attackers, the Magecart attackers who are trying to perform this attack, their intention would be to find some kind of flaws. If they happen to find some kind of flaws, by flaws which I mean is specifically vulnerability, no, both of them do not mean the same thing, but I'm talking about the code or the logic flaw that may actually result into vulnerability. So the attackers are actually looking for some kind of vulnerabilities that they can exploit. A lot of time attacks such as supply chain attacks, these things are present there and these help in performing the Magecart attack. Also, it is very difficult for normal users to differentiate this attack from a normal digital transaction because the kind of domains that they are using looks very legitimate, because they are very professional kind of hackers. They, from the very beginning, from information gathering to the end of this kind of attack, like the exploitation part, what they're trying to do is whatever they do is either obfuscated very well, or they're using some kind of legitimate websites. They are using some kind of services such as cloud services, such as Google Cloud, AWS, so that it becomes very difficult for the normal users to differentiate between an actual digital transaction and a kind of attack that might be happening. Apart from that, the Magecart attackers also mimic the actual existing domains. Now, we all are aware of the phishing attack, where sometimes if there is, suppose if your website's name is just organization.com, just a random website name that I'm giving, what they would do that instead of the first O, they might use 0. A normal user would not see the difference between organization and the phishing link that they have created by replacing O with 0. So this is the kind of things that they do. Of course, there are other ways also. There sometimes the characters look very same, but their ASCII values are very different. So this is how the attackers sometimes mimic the known existing domains, and the normal users do not understand, of course, because they're not aware of the fact. And it is very difficult for people to actually see whichever website they're using to see the difference. But of course, we can always create some kind of awareness. Another thing is when they're creating or they're performing this kind of attack, the Magecart attackers are professional enough to detect the kind of browser the victim user is using. So if the victim is aware that there has been some kind of attack, and if they're trying to do some kind of investigation from their end, they would get aware. And if the attackers get aware, they would try to delete all the traces behind. And of course, the attackers, after performing the exploitation, a successful exploitation, they actually try to delete all their traces, all the logs that may prove that they have performed the attack. So these are some of the ways how the Magecart attackers are trying to perform this attack. And it does look like, the way we are discussing about it, it does look very simple, but it is not as simple as it looks like. While deobfuscating a malicious JavaScript code, it becomes very difficult to analyze what is happening, because you cannot thoroughly understand at first. It takes hours and hours for for a researcher to deobfuscate the code. Sometimes some tools perform the deobfuscation or beautify the code in a very different way. Sometimes you have to do some manual work in that way. So the next thing would be the approach. So once you have understood what a Magecart attack is, why is it happening, and how is it happening? So we, as security researchers or security professionals, what we could do if we come across these kinds of applications. So we have to detect the malicious scripts in the JavaScript code. How do you detect the malicious scripts in the JavaScript code? You have to go through the entire code. You have to figure out what the logic is. Then you try to break down the logic. You do use debuggers sometimes. Actually, for doing some kind of reverse engineering with these applications, you do have to use debuggers to totally break it down. But even though if sometimes you do not require, it is possible to go through the JavaScript code. Here, I'm just talking about going through the JavaScript code. So you are detecting the malicious scripts. You have to see what is happening. Now, how do you identify it is a malicious script? Either it is, either it is trying to make a connection with any kind of URL that it is not supposed to, or maybe it is trying to make some kind of function calls that this application should not be doing. Let me give you an example. For example, if you have an application in your mobile phone which is just supposed to click your pictures and do some editing like camera, it should only be asking for your files permission, from where it can actually take your pictures and perform all the editing tasks that it wants to. But if it is asking for your location, then it does not make any sense. At that point of time, it gets very suspicious of the fact that why is it asking for a location? The same goes for this JavaScript code that we are talking about. We already know that this application is meant for something else. Now, the next thing is, we are already aware of the fact that there has been insertion of some kind of malicious code snippet within the code. Now, we know how the application functions. So we are already aware of the fact what it might be dependent on, what kind of calls it might be making. So while analyzing the code, if you see any kind of weird or suspicious calls it is trying to make, or it is trying to connect with some other URLs, which doesn't look very proper or a genuine one or authentic, at that time, that is one point which you can consider as one suspicious thing, one suspicious script. You can take it out and do further analysis about it. Now, the second approach about detecting malicious script would be deobfuscating the code. Because in real world scenario, the codes are not that simple. It's not like you have been given a JavaScript code, you look at it, you understand, okay, this is the flaw, this is the malicious program, and let's just stop it or do other kind of mitigations that we need to do. It does not work that way. So you have to perform obfuscation, code obfuscation. So how do you perform code obfuscation? You have to manipulate the syntax. Now, within a JavaScript code, of course, they're using the obfuscation is such that either they're making some changes to the variable names or to the values, and it is very gibberish. It becomes very difficult to actually analyze what is happening over there. So when you see that there are some kind of gibberish things, gibberish strings that have been used a number of times, you can start analyzing with it first. Like, where it has been used, in which particular part of the code. Is it being used within any circular brackets? If yes, then there might be a chance that this particular string is an argument or a parameter to some kind of function which is getting called. So in that case, what you can do is you can change that gibberish string or of course string into some other kind of name. You can change its name maybe, so that it gets easier for you to understand. For example, if the gibberish name string is something like ABCD, which have been used a number of times, you can change it to string A or input 1, so that while you're going through the rest of the code, it becomes easier for you to analyze what is happening. This is how you are actually simplifying the code. So while explaining manipulation of the syntax, I gave you an example of how you can check the patterns. So the next thing is, of course, you have to see the patterns because you're trying to deobfuscate the code. Once you understand the pattern, it gets a bit easier to deobfuscate it and then go ahead with it. It takes a number of hours. It takes a long time for you to perform the entire deobfuscation, but it is possible. It may take some time. You may write a simpler script to replace. Of course, if you're using Sublime or any proper kind of text editor, you can use find and replace them all. It gets easier with that. But of course, you'll have to go through the entire code at once to see what is happening. So what is actually happening over here that I was trying to explain? So you try to look for a set of data that have been used a number of times. So either as a variable or a parameter to any kind of function. So if it is a variable, how would it look like? Like where some kind of gibberish string equal to something gibberish. So beside this where, that particular gibberish thing, you can look for that string somewhere else. And as I explained before, you're looking for the pattern. You're looking for, is it getting called somewhere else as well as a parameter to any kind of function? That makes it easier. So the next step after analyzing and identifying those patterns, you try to decrypt the obfuscated code. Here, I'm only trying to give you an approach towards how you can identify Magecart attack, or if you are willing to analyze one on your own, you can follow this approach. I have not done any kind of actual analysis here, but we'll be talking about it. So you try to identify these patterns so that it gets easier for you to decrypt the obfuscated code. Once you deobfuscate the code, the next thing is to identify the logic behind it. How do you understand the logic behind it? Again, simple. You can try to look for the kind of calls it might be making, any kind of suspicious URLs it is trying to connect with. Is it trying to call any kind of function that it is not supposed to? Or is it trying to take some kind of data from the user's detail? What kind of functions it is using? Again, you will have to do a lot of research on that so that you can identify the logic very well. So these are the 3 steps that are mostly followed. Of course, these are all interconnected, interlinked, and that is how it goes on. Sometimes you may not require to do any kind of obfuscation and itself becomes easier, but a number of times it is important to obfuscate the code. Now, once it gets decrypted, you have to identify the logic. Again, this logic part is always there. If it is a malicious kind of code, there would be a logic, there would be something that it is trying to do. A number of times, as I mentioned in the note part, a number of times the code may use some functions like D2A to modify the data. So they are either trying to, sometimes they actually they convert it into base 64 or in some other kind of symbols, and within the code itself they have somewhere mentioned how to again change it back from base 64 to the normal characters that can be used as in the JavaScript in a normally. So all these things are already mentioned over there. So you just have to keep looking and analyzing, and you have to have patience, because of course it takes a lot of time. But yeah, it's worth it because they're doing a proper analysis of a kind of attack, which is very serious. So we will look at some example. Actually, this is not that big kind of example, but I'll show how it looks like. So I have taken this snippet from cloudsec.com. I mentioned the link over there. So this is just one code snippet because I don't think I should be putting other links also, other code snippets as well. So here you can see that the where they have used something, looks like hex. Maybe it is not hex, maybe it is something else. We don't know what is it. So something 0x34d5 equal to, there's some kind of maybe strings. It also looks like maybe it is in base 64 format. So what you will be trying to do is you'll try to see if it can be changed, like decoded using base 64. If yes, then you may get some kind of values, because of course if it is giving some kind of value, you would be able to understand. And decoding it into some other thing, decoding it using base 64, and if it does not give anything else, or it again gives some kind of gibberish, then of course we can be sure that then it is some kind of other obfuscation technique they have used. Sometimes they might use a number of times to convert it into base 64. For example, they have not just converted or encoded it using base 64 only once. They might have encoded it twice or thrice, or maybe 10 times, 20 times, depending upon the kind of attackers, how much obfuscation, how strong the obfuscation they want to provide to this piece of code. They sometimes perform some kind of rotation of the strings, and when you look throughout the code, you would see that how they are actually reversing the entire process as well. So these things are present. You have to go through the entire code, and that is how you'll analyze. Another way is where you're not able to understand what is happening. Like for example, you can see that how the variable name is something very different. So you can either see if it is actually representing something, or if it is not representing anything, you can try to change it to some other kind of variable for your sake, so that it becomes easier for you to understand, and you can perform the further analysis on your own without any further issue. So once analyzing, understanding what is happening, how are we doing each and everything, the final part that comes into picture is the mitigation. Because as I mentioned in the very beginning, is what, why, and how. Our agenda is to understand what is this kind of attack, and the final thing is what the solution could be. So we'll understand the solution of this attack in a very very simplest way, because it is quite difficult sometimes to mitigate it. It's not like that it's impossible to mitigate the attack, but of course sometimes it becomes difficult to mitigate. So there are certain easiest things that you can try to do, is like using some effective monitoring or detection tools that can help you in understanding if there is some kind of malicious code that have been inserted. The first and foremost thing that you as an organization, as a security professional in an organization, should be trying to do is understanding and checking if whichever application you're using and whichever third party tools or software it is dependent on, all of them are secured enough. You have to make sure that those third-party softwares are also well upgraded, updated from your end and from the vendor's end as well. Again, you have to make sure that you have to check whether any new kind of vulnerability or maybe a 0-day have been recently found about that application. If yes, try to mitigate it, update it, patch it, and then use it. So that uh, at least the attackers won't be able to use those vulnerabilities as one of the reason for hacking your organization and stealing all the PII details. So some effective tools would be very helpful. Patching these things, patching the application softwares, updating and upgrading them all would be very helpful, so that of course, as I said, so that these things can be prevented, at least. Again, as I mentioned before, nothing is 100% secure. It is really not possible. And of course, if you see that an application which seems to be very secure today may not be secure tomorrow. Every individual has their own approach, and anybody would be easily able to find some other kind of flaw into that secured application, and then again find a vulnerability and hence exploit it. So the thing that we can perform, the thing that we can do is taking all the necessary steps to mitigate them. So apart from patching, updating, and upgrading, another thing that you can do is practicing some good security practices. I mean, implementing some good security practices in the organization, like the ones that I recently that I mentioned just now, like that it should be patched and updated regularly. Again, it is very important that you can implement a sandbox. Now, what is a sandbox? So it is a kind of environment which is created around your application, so that in case of any attack that happens in that application, it won't affect the entire organization, and that particular part could be taken care of later by the security professionals. So most of the time what happens, like if there is any kind of ransomware attack or such kind of big attacks happening in the website or in a huge organization, their main aim is to harm the entire organization, steal maybe all their data, compromise the entire enterprise. So if there is an application which, if the things that are the applications which are actually towards they're using internet, or they have to be on the internet, because of course, because e-commerce websites have to be used by the normal users. So in that case, these things should be implemented in a sandbox environment. I'll give you one example of a kind of attack that is I'm sorry, that is sometimes very difficult to mitigate. For example, if there is an application which is if there is a website that is there to teach you what command injection is. So of course, it will be giving you answer or output related to the kind of command, system-based commands that you will be inserting or putting over there. As a result, if you try to get access to the server, it is possible. Getting access to the server, what do I mean by that? Is like you are running some other kind of system-based commands as well. And for example, like NC or netcat or something, and you're able to run it from the server itself, not from the browser now. So it is possible. Now, you cannot call it an attack, and how they're actually taking care of that. Are we actually using their server for performing this attack, or while they're teaching us what command injection is, or any kind of injection which is based on your website, or the attack which is happening through your browser, are they actually making their server vulnerable? Are we actually able to see their websites, their output of their server? No, they have set up a way where that vulnerable part is in a sandbox environment. So whatever is happening, it is actually just giving you details of the or output of that sandbox environment, and you're not getting access to that actual system or their actual organization. So it is actually helpful. It is actually mitigating or protecting from protecting your organization from such kind of huge attack scenarios. So it is very important to implement a sandbox environment. And the last, of course, these are not enough, but these are some of the steps that one should follow. But last, one important thing that one has to take care of is implementing a good CSP policy. This will not only help you with the Magecart kind of attacks, but other malicious from other kinds of attacks as well. We are aware that how CSP and implementation of certain security headers could prevent your application from cross-site scripting or clickjacking or other client-side based attacks. So it is very important. So what does a CSP header does or policy does is it is a content security policy, and it is actually avoiding any malicious scripts from loading. So sometimes when you're also trying to perform cross-site scripting kinds of attack, it is again a client-side based attack, then you are injecting a script that is getting executed. So at that point of time, if it gets executed, it means that that application is vulnerable, and as a result, you may exploit it. So if the application, if the header is preventing it from injecting these kinds of malicious content, then the third party, the implementation of third party tools, if the third party tools are present over there, and if there is any kind of malicious script present within it, then it may help in avoiding the loading of those scripts as well. So overall, CSP is helping in preventing a number of attacks, Magecart being one of them, and one of the very serious kind of attack. So you have to also make sure that just putting CSP header is not enough, but it should be configured very properly. It should be made sure that it is configured to the point that any third-party malicious scripts do not get loaded. So these are some of the ways how you can take care of your organization and prevent it from getting attacked from the Magecart hackers, maybe. So these are some of the references. And I did mention about the Magecart attack in my blog also, in my article as well. If you want, you can go through it. Apart from that, these are some other references also. If you want to go through it, you can, I'll try to share with you all. You can reach out to me through my LinkedIn or Twitter profile. I'll be more than happy to help.